at all. They came in civilian vehicles, mostly cars. That was all. I was to organize them into formation, appoint non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, and field commissioned subalterns, lieutenants and second lieutenants. I did not bat an eyelid, but simply went to work at maximum speed. Then I remember that I, myself, should be in uniform. But I had none whatsoever, and my men had none to spare. I rushed to the headquarters, got hold of Ifeajuna, and collected a pair of his own uniform, his own spear. When I put it on, it had his new badge of the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Later in the day, the commander sent me a message that I had been promoted Lieutenant Colonel. I'm going to take a short break, and you can call it a tea break now, okay? Just to be sure that I am still communicating. You get what I mean? Not too fast, and then clearer enough. Thank you. So let us continue. Later in the day, the commander sent me a message that I had been promoted. Lieutenant Colonel. It was perhaps the first promotion made in the Liberation Army. I went to work again, preparing to liberate the remainder of Nigeria from the clutches of Gowon's rebel army. Back in Edokpolo barracks, I divided my units into companies, platoons, and sections. They were about 700 in number and would make a good battalion if they were well armed. We had managed to seize a few more weapons from the armory of the Midwest Command, which was then at our disposal. However, only 100 or 14% of my men were armed. Since none had used a weapon before, I started training them in the rudiments of weapon handling. At the same time, we were ready to drive off towards Ibadan, if at any moment the order was given. But why was the order delayed? The order was delayed because there was a sharp disagreement between Commander-in-Chief of the Biafran Army, the Commander-in-Chief of the Biafran Army, Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu of the Biafran Army. And then that of the commander of the Liberation Army of Nigeria. You see this complexity here now. But let me finish that, that paragraph. In fact, let me repeat that again in clarity so that I know you get what I meant in what I read there, okay? But for clarity, let me take that again, okay? So they said the order was delayed because there was a sharp disagreement between the Commander-in-Chief of the Biafran Army, Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, and the commander of the Liberation Army of Nigeria, the newly promoted Brigadier Banjo. So what clarity I'm trying to pitch and bring out there is this. In the history that some of us have been, propagated with, was that the Biafran Army, Ojukwu, was going to take over Yoruba land, and it was Biafran Army advancing. We were never really clearly told that the prisoners that Irosi jailed because of the January 15, 1966 coup, who were part of the now declared Biafra Republic under Ojukwu. Ojukwu released them from the prison. And in their own way, as part of the war, they formed an army they called Liberation Army of Nigeria, but under the Biafran Army. So it was this liberation army led by Banjo, Victor Banjo, a former prisoner of Nigeria, trapped in the eastern part of Nigeria, released and freed by Ojukwu, right? Their own contribution to the war is to say, okay, we are forming our own army and we are going after Ojukwu. I mean, we are going after Gowon. I think that clarity is very important. And when the news said, when the report, the history said, Victor Banjo was convicted of treason, that is going against the order of Ojukwu. That part of history was also not clearly stated, but propagated. It was as if Victor Banjo willingly and others like him willingly joined the Biafran army and to be part of Biafra Republic. Okay? And indeed, after doing all of that for the Biafrans, Ojukwu still killed him. Ojukwu is blamed for the intended invasion of Yoruba land. Yoruba land that has been opposed through their own military governor, opposed to any use of military force in Biafra, suddenly realized that there were some army coming in. But this army was not Biafran army. And they were not ordered by Ojukwu, among other things. Just for clarity. Right? The Liberation Army was led by Victor Banjo, who still believe, including this writer, the army he joined is the Liberation Army of Nigeria. How come they didn't say much about the Liberation Army of Nigeria, but we know a lot about the Biafran Army? And every atrocity of this genocide is sort of put on the Biafran Army. We're not told about this Liberation Army, or they made them look like insignificant. But this piece of information can help you to understand that part of history very well. And how propaganda has managed to keep it that way for decades. The Biafrans, they wouldn't have, the Yorubas wouldn't have, be against Biafra, if not because the Biafrans were coming to attack Yorubas. That was easy, but that's not what happened. That's not what happened. But let us continue. Listen to this. Including the takeover of the Midwest. Are you listening? Because when Ojukwu declared Biafra, Midwest, Benin, Warri, they were still part of Nigeria until the Liberation Army of Victor Banjo took over the Midwest. But they didn't say that in their own, propagated history. They said the Biafran armies took over Midwest. And today, you will see the people of our people of the Midwest. Some of them, the Benins, fighting themselves over something. Some says they hate Igbos. Okay? Simply because when Biafra was declared, truly, Midwest was not part of it. But those who took over the Midwest, they didn't take over Midwest for Biafra. They took over Midwest in their own believed efforts of liberating Nigeria from Gowon's rebel that has now formed government over Nigeria. I think that's very important. That's very critical. But let's continue. The latter wanted to secure Benin in good hands before proceeding to Ibadan, so that he was not suddenly cut off from Biafra. He preferred the name as Ishekiri or Benin, not an Igbo, as the military administrator of the Midwest. Actually, his first choice was Brigadier Ejo, the Eastward military governor. He spent his first few hours in Benin trying to convince the latter to accept the post. Ejo declined and chose to disappear from Benin. He later surfaced in Lagos, claiming that he had traveled by bicycle. Next, Banjo chose Lieutenant Colonel Trimnell and Ishekiri and the director of supply and transport of the Midwest Command. Ojukwu rejected the nomination. By then, Banjo had already made his broadcast over Benin Radio, clearly explaining his stance in the crisis. He did not believe in Biafra or secession. He was only out to liberate Nigeria from the oppression of the northern oligarchy, which had installed Gowon in office and mandated him to crush Ojukwu by force. Banjo did not believe that the war was necessary. He believed in the January 15 coup and his laudable aims and objectives, which he would now strive harder to achieve. All this was too much for Ojukwu to bear. He at once recalled Banjo from Benin to Enugu and gave the latter a piece of his mind. Seeing that the entire Liberation Army was sponsored and funded by Ojukwu, there was little that Banjo could do except bow to his request. So, Major, listen to that again. Oh. The Liberation Army was funded by the Eastern region, and their intention was not to liberate Nigeria. They did not want to take over Nigeria. And immediately Victor Banjo was going that route. The person who is sponsoring you was like, come. I'm not going to, no, we are not going to do this. And that simply means you will now have the resources you want to go and use to liberate Nigeria. So this was the beginning of the disagreement between between Ojukwu, Biafra, and Banjo and others who were part of the revolutionary coup, or kind of lumped into the revolutionary coup of January 15, 1966, clearly. So let's continue. He did not believe, that's, what do you call it? That is Victor Banjo. So all this was too much for Ojukwu to bear, so he called him. He said, so, seeing that the entire Liberation Army was sponsored and funded by Ojukwu, there was little that Banjo could do except to bow to his request. So Major Okonkwo, an Igbo medical officer of the Midwest Command, was appointed the military administrator of the Midwest, taking your ground. Banjo was to muster his troop and proceed to Ibadan. If Ibadan was taken, Ojukwu reserved the right to name the military governor, and he had named, listen to this, so he had named Lieutenant Colonel Ademoyega himself tentatively for that post. So here is another twist to it again. The moment Victor Banjo was saying he was liberating, Nigeria was liberating Nigeria from Ojukwu. And the agenda of Biafra was to maintain their own independence and all that. If you want me to fund this, then that means I will have to command or control whatever comes out of it. So Ojukwu joined at that point, I believe. Now let's continue. Third, even this writer was to be named as the military governor of Ibadan, an army led by Victor Banjo, or a liberation army. So if Lagos was taken, Ojukwu reserved, that's what they had agreed. This is like an agreement. Oh. If you go there and do what you want to do, and you take Lagos and you take Ibadan, I reserve the right to name the governor there, since I am the one funding you and your liberation army. So that's part of their deal now, going forward. Here, he also reserved the right to give to Banjo such an appointment as he deemed fit. It was on this basis of this agreement that Banjo returned to Benin early on Saturday, August 12, 1967. By then, the momentum of the initial advance to Midwest, which could have led to the immediate capture of Ibadan, had been lost by 72 hours. By that time, federal authorities in Lagos had recovered from their shock and marshaled a force of a company's strength, supported by ferrets and mortars to delay the Liberation Army from advancing further westwards. So to them now, the Liberation Army, it is like them versus the Northern Rebel Army who has taken over Nigeria. That time, it was like another attempt to challenge Gowon and his backers. But they've lost ground. They were ill-equipped. Let's continue. The federal company planted its forward platoon on the hill overlooking Siluko River, which was the most significant landmark between Ore and Benin. The remainder of the company were stationed in Ore at the Ijebu-Ondo junction. They had planted themselves on the feature and ranged their mortars on the Benin-Ore road before our own forces finally left Benin late on the 12th for Ibadan. Actually, what was called the IOI division, 101 division, consisted of only 3 battalions. The 4th was the one newly formed in Benin and commanded by me. The first 3 were the 12th commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Akaga, the 13th commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Evenso, and the 18th commanded by Major Chukuka. On entering the Midwest on the August 9, the 13th Battalion veered northwards and was located at Auchi to protect the northern flank of the region. The 18th Battalion veered southward and was based in Warri, protecting the southern flank. The 12th Battalion led the advance and took Benin. As soon as they were in Benin, the troops got loose and started to alienate the feelings of the local communities from themselves. But they were soon gathered again to continue the advance. The 72 hours that elapsed between the capture of Benin and the resumption of the advance had lowered both the morale and the capabilities of the troops. This later proved an intractable problem. The 12th Battalion was again the leading unit in the advance to Ibadan. It had a few Land Rovers and lorries which formed the vanguard. The remainder were cars, and purely civilian vehicles. It was followed by my own unit, now christened the 19th Battalion. We were all in cars, and we formed the rear of the movement. The command group of the division was controlled by Brigadier Banjo and was placed in between the 2 battalions. We had already advanced some miles from Benin when we approached the Siluko Hill feature. We did not anticipate any opposition. Otherwise, we should have moved more slowly with headlamps switched off and our forward troops on guard for immediate deployment and engagement. The sudden burst of small arms and machine gun fire, followed by this fall of mortar bombs, came as a rude shock to our super confident and relaxed forward troops. The troops quickly got out of their vehicles since they did not have sufficient training or fighting experience. They hardly knew what exactly was expected of them. So they did not quickly form up to clear the known enemy position. Instead, they were scattered, finding no answers to the enemy mortar. Actually, the whole division had no support weapons at all, not even 2-inch mortars. Besides a few machine guns, the divisions had no high caliber weapons of any description. At the same time, there was an utter lack of well-trained and battle-worthy young officers who could immediately organize to take the battle to the enemy location. Since the mortar shelling was continuous and since we simply made ourselves fixed and easy targets in our lined-up position, the enemy retained the initiative and continued to harass us where we were. The divisional commander went further forward to assess the situation. After a detailed appreciation of the situation, he ordered the rear unit to return to Benin. We were followed by a gradual withdrawal of the forward troops. It was the first setback of the Liberation Army in the Midwest. We had sustained quite a few casualties, which were evacuated to the military hospital in Benin. Banjo was soon in contact with Ojukwu, stressing our urgent need for support weapons in order to dislodge the enemy on Siluko Hills. By the next day, Sunday, August 13, Banjo had found that my friend Ifeajuna was not very useful to him at the divisional headquarters. Actually, Ifeajuna had not settled down to any serious work since they advanced into the Midwest. The headquarters was not at all organized, and logistical necessities were not properly taken into account. We already had a battle on our hand, and it would no longer be easy to capture Ibadan. That same day, Banjo made a drastic change in his headquarters. He sent for me and briefed me on the political and tactical situation in Biafra. First, he explained, both he and Nzeogu had urged Ojukwu to organize the fight on a national scale, but Ojukwu refused. Nzeogu even volunteered to stretch the Biafran defenses straight to the Benue River line, beyond Makurdi, and to the Benue-Niger confluence in Lokoja. But such an action would at once have put parts of Kaba and Benue provinces on the part of the east, and the war could then have been fought mainly in the north, using both the Benue and the Niger River lines as the natural defensive lines. But Ojukwu would have nothing to do with such a bold plan. Then he further explained he had suggested that they should break the bounds and make for Lagos, while the east was still part of Nigeria, so as to enlist the help of other southerners. Again, Ojukwu recalcitrated. It was this that nearly finished the personal relationship that existed between Ojukwu and himself, since their military careers started together in Lagos in the 50s. But how did Nzeogu die? I asked him. Nzeogu was not given any command, he explained. But as you well know, he was not content to remain idle. He simply told himself that he would certainly not sit bemoaning his lot while federal troops were advancing to capture him. He used to take a handful of volunteers on daring raids against the federal troops at Nsukka. That was all he was doing until he fell into their hands. Why did Ojukwu deny the report? I asked him. Banjo smiled and said, but that is what he does all the time. After that, Banjo explained to me that he had formed the headquarters of the 101 Division 3 weeks earlier in Enugu and used it effectively to control the activities of the two Biafra brigades fighting in both the Nsukka and Ogoja sectors. He said that it was he who intervened successfully to slow down the rate of advance of the federal troops towards Enugu. Ojukwu, he further stated, had seen the usefulness of his strategy. As a result of this confidence in him, when he suggested the Midwest and Lagos moves, Ojukwu was obliged to accept. But I do not like Biafra, and I am not a Biafran. He remonstrated. I do not like Biafra either, said Banjo. I told Ojukwu not to declare Biafra. I warned him not to secede. I stayed with him in the State House after he had released me from detention and did everything possible to stop him from declaring secession. He would not yield. The very day that he declared secession, I moved out of the State House into one of the flats belonging to the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria in Enugu and remained there ever since. Then why didn't you take leave of Ojukwu and make a quiet return to Lagos? I asked him. Gowon would not have it. I had been in touch with him since August 1966. His only offer was that I should be transferred to another prison in Lagos. After Ojukwu had released us, Gowon would still not have us step into the Midwest or West or Lagos. This is our only opportunity to fight our way back. But militarily, the situation is quite hopeless. What do we have to match the federal superiority in arms? I asked. Ojukwu is expecting some small arms and support weapons, Banjo replied. He had promised me a good chunk of them. As soon as we can get some of that, we shall continue the advance, Banjo concluded. After that, he gave me the job of his chief of staff, explaining that Ifeajuna was in no mood to settle down into any particular job, but was interested in very many things at the same time. So he was sending him back to Enugu to act as our liaison officer with Ojukwu, so as to help us get those things that we needed to carry on the war. I accepted the appointment and took up my residence at the divisional headquarters location. It was then that I started to study what the division had for its operation. As a matter of fact, the division was very thin on the ground. The only operational battalion was the 12th, which was formed in Ogoja sector before it was transferred to the Midwest sector. Even then, that unit had no support weapons. The newly formed 19th Battalion was not at all equipped. The rifles in the old unit were not sufficient for a single company. Besides that, there were no other weapons. The 11th Battalion stationed in Auchi was deployed 2 up. One company was pitched at the outskirts of Okene towards the north. The other company was pitched at Agenebode towards the east. The 3rd company was held in reserve at Auchi, the battalion headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Evenso, who commanded the unit, was soon down at Benin to request for reinforcement. His unit had only 3 machine guns and rifles. They had very little ammunition for the rifles and no support weapons at all. The 18th Battalion based in Warri was also deployed 2 up, having one company at Ugeli, another company at Sapele, and the reserve company at Warri. They had only 2 machine guns and no more, and there were no support weapons at all. This was rather depressing. However, we were expecting a good supply of weapons, including a few 3-inch mortars as support weapons. If this came in time, we would be mobilized. Banjo was quickly summoned to Enugu again, and I kept the headquarters as his chief of staff, deputy commander. Actually, there was very little to command, since we could hardly be said to be operational. However, we were on radio link with Enugu. Besides, reports were coming in from the unit's locations, telling us their urgent needs for military stores, which we could not immediately meet. By Monday 14th, one of the senior officers of the Midwest Command, Lieutenant Colonel Igboba, surfaced and reported to me at the divisional headquarters. I quickly appointed him to command the 19th Battalion, which I had lately formed. He went to the battalion location, surveyed his military worth, and was totally appalled. He rushed back to me to give me his impression that the so-called battalion was simply a rabble. I smiled and ordered him to make a battalion of them. He left and went to work, using his local knowledge to fish out more weapons. He found a few NCOs and young officers and commenced weapon training for the unit. Within a week, we took delivery of a single 3-inch mortar barrel and a few mortar bombs. We also received a number of rifles and ammunition. This greatly boosted our morale. I sent the mortar barrel to the 12th Battalion and distributed the small arms between the 12th and the 19th battalions. Now let me take another break. Call it a tea break. One moment, please. For my friends on TikTok. So there is a bit of verify this, verify that stuff. Thank you so much, okay, for listening and at the same time for sharing it. Inviting those that probably should be listening to this. A lot of people can sit back and enjoy this book, you know, like savor it, digest it, and be able to even like process it, learn from it. Okay, do not become a Nazi. I mean, a narcissistic bigot. Do not inherit the enemies mentioned in this book. So learn from them.